Many men have gone. When they come, I will stand my ground. Stand my ground. I'll never be afraid.
Adjust fire, estimated over. Rapid, this is Steel Rain. Adjust fire, estimated out.
This video is the first in the Normandy D-Day series, and in this episode we look at the doomed Dieppe raid and explore how the failures at Dieppe led to vital lessons being learned and contributed to the successful invasion of Normandy that would follow only 2 years later. Rather than look in detail at the Dieppe invasion, we're going to look at just one of the beaches that was raided on the 19th of August 1942, where of the almost 5,000 Canadians who embarked on the operation, only 2,210 would return to England. This is the Blue Beach at Dieppe.
Stand my ground. I'll never be afraid. Thoughts ahead, take away my fear.
This operation was known as Operation Jubilee, more commonly known today as the disaster at Dieppe. And essentially it constituted nothing more than a full frontal invasion onto a heavily defended beach. In fact, a number of beaches. The Germans were informed of the attack, which is something we'll come on to. The Allies relied predominantly on tanks. They definitely believed that the firepower provided by tanks was going to be a battle winner, and they believed that the tanks would be able to destroy fortifications on the beach to allow the infantry, and this force was made up predominantly of infantry and engineers, to make a successful assault. And it just didn't happen.
In 1942, Adolf Hitler was master of Europe and controlled northern France. The Allies sought a victory, and the forces of Canada were petitioning to deliver it. Planning was now underway for what Winston Churchill later called a reconnaissance in force. The location for this raid was the French port city of Dieppe, where it was claimed the Allies would raid the port, secure the heights on its flanks, while intelligence was gathered on the German defences. Perhaps it's claimed even secure Enigma encryption material before the force would then extract. There were 4 main beaches: green, red, white and blue, with 2 additional flanking beaches. Air cover was provided from southern England, but there was a distinct lack of aerial bombardment, and this consisted almost exclusively of a combat air patrol. Naval bombardment was present, but the calibre and the weight of fire was so small it had no real impact in neutralising the strongpoints. The assaulting forces would have to rely on direct fire support from the tanks as the infantry assaulted the beaches. The Germans were alerted to the attack, and they were waiting. By chance, the assault was delayed by 20 minutes thanks to a run-in with a German naval patrol that disrupted the initial stages of the operation. The Royal Regiment of Canada would lead the assault on Blue Beach.
So the Canadians were responsible for the 2 internal flanking beaches, and then there was external flanking beaches as well. So this is one of those internal beaches at Pise. And this is basically designed to secure the high feature, the high terrain that overlooks Dieppe, and the main assault would take place at Dieppe. And you can see the high ground that they would have had to secure. So they had to land here on this position because they couldn't land closer and scale the cliffs. They had to land here at Pise, take the defences, and then secure the high ground that basically controlled the observation and fire into the town. So walking along the beach now, and you can hear the stones underneath my feet. It's really actually quite difficult to walk, let alone get a tank up here. And you can see the shelf as well. Anyone who fought tanks could land here and effectively make it up to a beach which had a really high seawall as well. It's just really poor planning. Essentially, what the tanks would have done is stayed stationary on the beach, providing that fire support. There's no way they could make it off this beach.
The Royal Regiment of Canada landed with 550 or so officers and soldiers, of which 237 would be killed on this beach, most against this sea wall.
And this is that location of the famous picture where you can see the Canadians who were essentially stuck against this seawall, that massive barbed wire like a rat's nest on top. And if you can see just behind that white truck with the blue line going down, the vertical line, behind that is a German machine gun post. And that machine gun post had fire all the way down this wall. There was a German account of the Canadians being stuck here like rats in the description. The machine gun fire was raking up and down this position, and this is where you can see all of those dead Canadians who fell here with nowhere to go. And to be quite frank, from my perspective, I think it's an absolute tragedy that this plan was allowed to even come to fruition. I've tried to line this up as best as I can, but at the base of what were steps right here, this is where all those Canadians who were trying desperately to get up this exit from the beach met their end. And you can see there was no option for the tanks to get off this beach. Absolute travesty. You look down the beach, where were the tanks going to go? The rocks are actually a little bit higher in 2023 than they were just over 80 years ago now. So this wall would have been much higher, and it was topped with barbed wire. You can see that from the picture I've put up as well. Lots of barbed wire on top, and you can see why the Canadians were trying to exit through that stairwell. Incredibly difficult to get off this beach. Almost impossible. Now let's go and see the machine gun nest where the Germans were positioned. We're now heading up to one of the main defensive German positions, perfectly sited along the seawall, and we're going to go and see what their view was like from there. And this is where the majority of the really deadly fire was coming from. You can see that obviously this has been closed up now, but this was the position that was firing right down that seawall. This first embankment bit wasn't necessarily there. I'm going to show you the view from the nest now. And so this is the angle of fire that this bunker is facing. You can see it's facing right down to that sea wall that we just visited and where all those Canadians were killed. Perfectly sited, as you might expect, and you can see the high ground behind it. And it was that high ground that the Canadians here were meant to take to prevent the Germans from firing down into Dieppe to control those heights. And of course, they were never going to get off this beach to be able to achieve that. Absolute disaster. So it was the Royal Regiment of Canada that pretty much landed here en masse. And out of 556 men that made up that battalion, 200 were killed in action here, with another 264 captured. Very few actually managed to get away. As I said before, it's an absolute disaster, and I cannot believe that the planners allowed this to happen. And the justification for it was that it set up the D-Day invasion at Normandy. But, you know, what a price to pay to learn some of these lessons. So some of the main reasons why it just absolutely failed here was because the naval engagement that happened before this operation caused them to be delayed. They're actually delayed by about 20 minutes. That meant that the smoke screen, which had been planned, had already dissipated. You know, smoke screen lasts for about 2 minutes if you're lucky, and that had already dissipated. And the Germans anticipated the attack. They were alerted to the naval engagement that occurred off the coast, and they were ready and waiting in positions just like this to fire down the beach onto that seawall where the Canadians were trapped. And finally we come to the memorial here at Blue Beach. On this beach, officers and men of the Royal Regiment of Canada died at dawn, 19th of August 1942, striving to reach the heights beyond. You who are alive on this beach, remember that these men died far from home, that others here and everywhere might freely enjoy life in God's mercy. And those are the heights that the Canadians who landed here were meant to have taken.
The action at Dieppe became one of the darkest days in Canadian military history, with extremely heavy losses. Of a force totalling almost 5,000 who were engaged for only 9 hours, the Canadian Army lost more prisoners than in the whole 11 months of the Northwest European campaign, or even the whole Italian campaign. No fewer than 1,946 Canadian officers and men became prisoners of war. Sadder still was the death toll, which amounted to 56 officers and 851 other ranks, 907 personnel in total. And while I focused on the Canadian Army, one mustn't forget the British Royal Marine Commandos and the US Army Rangers who also took part in this raid. Nevertheless, there were many lessons identified, but I will focus on only 6 of those lessons for this video. Number 1. Aerial bombardment had not been considered due to the small, narrow beaches at Dieppe and the inaccuracy of the British nighttime bombers. The US day bomber force was still in its infancy, having conducted its first mission only 2 days prior to the mission at Dieppe. Number 2. Direct fire support. Of the 29 tanks that did manage to land on the beach, only 15 tanks made it into the town itself, many becoming stuck, digging trenches with their tracks in the large loose shingle. The main armament was also insufficient in neutralising the German strongpoints, so why was no heavy naval gunfire support substituted for the lack of aerial bombardment? Well, the Admiralty policy of the time was that capital ships should not operate in the confines of the Channel, given the risk of enemy action. As a result, only the 4-inch guns present could offer any form of indirect fire support, but they lacked the ability to effectively communicate with the land forces. 4. Beach topography and the study of the conditions was at the forefront of the planners' minds after Dieppe. It became clear that beaches at Dieppe were too steep in gradient, and the beach is not suitable for armoured vehicles. They set about identifying large, low-gradient beaches with sand suitable for taking the weight of armoured vehicles and the many support vehicles required to sustain an army. The beaches of Normandy were found to have a favourable grade and perfect medium-grained sand in most locations. 5. Anti-tank obstacles in Dieppe meant none of the tanks that did make it ashore could manoeuvre through the town. Following the raid, some tanks were modified for locations where the sand was of a finer grain or where obstacles needed to be defeated. This gave rise to the AVRE variants of the Royal Engineers. 6. The Dieppe raid was originally delayed due to the weather, and the soldiers were returned to their accommodation and their billets, where they awaited a new date for the raid. It is assumed that soldiers may have discussed the pending operation, and this intelligence made its way back to German forces. As a result, prior to D-Day, holding areas were used to keep soldiers in a confined area, even though the D-Day invasion was also delayed due to bad weather. So there we have a brief look at the Dieppe raid by looking at the Allied landing on Blue Beach only. This was actually the first time I visited Blue Beach. I've been to Dieppe before, and I have to say I got pretty emotional seeing that seawall and trying to imagine a young platoon commander leading his men up that beach, only to realise there was nowhere to go. The Allies relied on surprise to give them a decisive advantage, but when surprise was taken away, they didn't have the direct or indirect fire support to suppress the enemy positions. Naval gunfire support would have made a big difference, but ultimately, I think this limited incursion into enemy-occupied territory was always doomed to fail. The German 302nd Infantry Division, who were based at Dieppe at the time, made this report. The main attack at Dieppe, Puys and Pourville was launched by the 2nd Canadian Division with great energy. That the enemy gained no ground at all in Puys and Dieppe was not the result of a lack of courage, but of the concentrated defensive fire of our divisional artillery and infantry heavy weapon systems. Moreover, his tank crews did not lack spirit. But the Dieppe raid, which was a reconnaissance in force as Churchill described it, did lead to the greatest seaborne invasion of modern times. And that is where this series is going next.
This is the BBC Home Service, and here is a special bulletin read by Simon Clark. D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European fortress. The first official news came just after 9:30, when Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force issued Communique Number 1. This said, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. The Allied Commander-in-Chief, General Eisenhower, has issued an order of the day addressed to each individual of the Allied Expeditionary Force. In it, he said, "Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory."